All right, we're about ready to start. We're actually starting early. Don't know how we pulled that off. Yeah? I don't know if it's the preacher. I don't think it was a preacher. I don't know. But maybe the battery's wrong in the clock. You never know. Usually, church clocks, they're like cockroaches. Nuclear explosion, they're still going to be on time. Church clock is never behind. Now, sometimes they'll creep a little ahead, but they're never behind. All right, I'm going to pass this around. Sherry Woodruff was telling me about it. It's the Senior Valentine Lunch. It's February 10th from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., and it includes lunch. And Sherry said that if you need a bus ride to it, they will come and pick you up. So, curbside service there. So she said, but if you need the bus to come get you, just sign your name and put in parentheses, bus next to it. Just bus, not bus next to it, but parentheses, bus. But go ahead and fill that out. And I'm going to pass it around. Carol, I'm going to give it to you and let you pass it back, and we'll work our way around. I think that'll work. Have we got everybody back in here? I think we're close then. Okay, turn over to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. That's where our study will be from this morning. We're here in the Faith Hall of Fame once again. And remember, we are working our way through. Chapter 10 is the apex of the book. You have your lettuces, Let us consider the Lord, let us consider one another, and let us consider about being together, the time which we spend together. And so he spends there 24 through 26, almost through 28, focusing on those three let us passages. And as he does that, from the rest of chapter 10, he goes back and he talks about the danger that we're in. If you turn away from the Lord, you're going to be lost. And if you turn away, you're going to lose everything which you have worked so hard to attain, and lose everything of which you had opportunity and possibility. And so to try to reinforce that, to try to reinforce people in their faithfulness, we go to chapter 11. And chapter 11 is what we call the Faith Hall of Fame. It's the most famous chapter, perhaps in Scripture. It's one of the first ones we learn as we go through and we see everybody as we go through there. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things which were not yet seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. Now you recall last week we talked about the substance, that is the assurance that we have in God, and how you and I can know that God exists even without the Bible. Now how do you know God exists even if you didn't have a Bible? How would you know God exists? Through what? If you didn't have a Bible, could you tell that God existed, that there was a God? Okay, by nature, right? What were you saying, Judy? Yeah, looking outside, by seeing nature. The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament shows his handiwork, right? It's the fool who says in his heart there is no God. Psalm 14:1. Psalm 19:1 is that first passage. Romans 1:20, by looking at this world, all people are without excuse, because you ought to, by looking at this world, know there's a God. God exists from many different ways as well. From just reason, all this had to come from something, right? All this has to come from something. Kyla yesterday was working on one of the boys' rooms. Whew, teenage boys. Working on the boys' room. How'd your room get so messy? I don't know, it just happened. Well, he would be a good evolutionist, wouldn't he? I don't know, it just happened. It just appeared one day. All right, so, it's kind of that sort of thing going on. Okay, and so those things which are not seen, the worlds were framed by the word of God. Now down to verse 4 of Hebrews 11. Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. Why was his sacrifice better? Okay, it's what God asked for. Whether it was the type, whether it was the manner, or whether it was the attitude, it was what God asked for. All right, that's an issue that happens a lot in the religious world today. We're not questioning ourselves when we worship about what God wants. Usually, what is it we're looking for when we go to worship? Or at least the world. What is the world looking for in worship? What satisfies us? Man, I want to go to the place that has really good music. Or I want to go to the place where it's a lot more entertaining or a lot more fun. Or I want to go, and a lot of times we're looking to satisfy ourselves. Satisfy exactly what it is that we want. What it is that amounts to what we like. Okay? Well, Cain was downhearted, downtrodden, because Abel was accepted and Cain was not. God comes to him there in Genesis and says, why are you downtrodden? Beware, sin is crouching at your door. If you handle it, you'll be okay, but if you let it remain, did he handle his sin or did he let it remain? It grew. It went from envy to bitterness to jealousy. We have to recognize there are times where that may happen to us. One of the greatest sins in the church is envy. Sometimes we're upset about what somebody has, or we're upset how somebody is recognized or seen as great in the church, or we're upset about how the way we were treated. And something which may have been just a very small matter, you think on it and think on it and think on it, and what happens to it? It grows bigger and bigger and greater and greater and greater. You ever heard of the Hatfields and McCoys? Okay, that's a little bit of East Kentucky, a lot of bit of West Virginia, right? What did all that boil down to? What was it they were fighting over? And 23 people died and 6 people served life sentences over. What was it? It was a pig, right? It was a pig, okay? And I think I mentioned to you before, working out in the country, when I was in college, I would be a youth minister, like a intern sort of thing in Winchester, Tennessee, Franklin County. And I remember talking to a family. Sometimes our kid would come, but not very often. And I remember going and visit the family and saying, hey, you need to come. And I've told you this story a million times, I think. But what had happened is back in the 1800s, the preacher's family, this is way before him, had sold this family a mule, and that mule died a week later. And that the preacher's family wouldn't wouldn't refund the money. Now, a mule's a big deal. Back then, people were very, very poor. Was it a big enough deal for people to have lost their soul from 1880 all the way to the year 2000? Not that big of a deal. But sometimes we will get one thing and we will allow it to grow into something major. And that's what's going on here with Cain. He was rebuked by God, and instead of blaming himself and making himself right, it's a lot easier to just blame the people who are righteous and to blame the people who are good. It's one of the reasons why Jesus says over in John 15, the world's going to hate you. The world hated me, it's also going to hate you as well. All right? Last week also we talked about Enoch. Enoch, you don't see much about him. He is I figured it up with somebody after church last week, the great-great-grandfather of Noah. Is that right? Is that correct? You've got Noah. Noah's father was it Lamech? Then you got Methuselah. Then you got Enoch. I think if you go backwards in that direction. And so Enoch, we don't know much about him, but we know that he was a friend with God and that he walked with God. And because he was a friend with God, God translated him and called him up to heaven. 2 people in the Old Testament who never died. Enoch, and who's the other one? Elijah. Excellent, excellent. Both of them friends with God, had that fellowship which was there. Not that I know of.
I've heard that there was.
Okay, well.
I've always wanted to read it, but can't find it.
Okay, go either on the internet or go to the Marshall County Library and look up a book called Apocalypse. You will have an Enoch and also some of those other books. And I think it's called the Annals of Enoch. I don't exactly remember the name of it. But it's a book written between 400 BC and 0 AD, but it's attributed to Enoch. And so they say that Enoch is the author of it, who wrote it. and it'll say some things about it. Now, you will run across this book a little bit in your commentaries if you run to the book of Jude, because some people say that Jude quoted from that Enoch, because some of that information which is there. I don't know if he did or not. I know that Jude was inspired by God, and so whatever he said was right, but I don't know enough to know exactly what went on there. But you read Jude chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, and you read a little bit of that about Jude, where it talks about Jude being a preacher. Now, there's something about the Old Testament when you talk about a preacher that's different about the New Testament, okay? As a preacher, one of my goals and hopes is that I convert somebody, you know? That's what you're after as a preacher, right? Is to convert and to teach, okay? A lot of times in the Old Testament, when that word karux, or that Greek word is used, talking about being a teacher or a preacher, his job is not to convert, but his job is more or less to pronounce sentence upon. Okay? Think about this. Noah preached for 120 years. Was it really his intention to save the whole world and put them on a boat with him? Probably not. But he preached by his actions, and he recognized that God's people, or the people, were not being faithful. And so he was telling them and pronouncing their sentence upon them. Old Testament prophets, as they're going and speaking, and you see that they don't really expect a repentance. Now, could they have repented? Yes. But their hearts were hard, and they were not going to repent. That's something I'm still thinking through in my mind. And if you got a thought about that, you might share it with me, and that way we can share one thought at least. Because I don't know about my thoughts sometimes. But I think that's something interesting to look at. Totally different than our lesson, though. Let's stay on the lesson. Now, talking about Enoch, we get to verse 6. Verse 6 you're familiar with because I quoted a lot. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. He who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek after him. Okay?
I like to think of faith
As
as power.
power.
I don't disagree with the word trust,
Yeah.
but I think that God created the world through his power.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with that. God created the world through his power. Absolutely. And think about Noah here as we think about the idea of faith seeing us through. As far as we know or think, according to Genesis 2, 5, and 6, the water had come up from the ground. There were quite a few tributaries and such during the days of Noah, during the days of creation. Where else? I think everybody has it. All right. It had never rained, okay? And so water was pretty much where water was. Now, the world was very lush. The world was very fertile, but it never rained. And so imagine when God came to Noah and talked about the earth flooding. If you had never seen rain, imagine what it would be like. Can you imagine that? My dad always had a joke when he, growing up in Odessa. Odessa, Texas receives about 8 inches of rain total a year. About what we get in 2 months here. And so it's desert. There's sand everywhere. There's no trees. And you think about that at first and you think, how horrible. But you can see the sunsets. You can see the world. You can see a lot further and everything. But he would always have a joke that, his dog had never seen rain. So he'd always keep all the sand in a jar. And that way, if it ever rained and his dog went crazy, he could just pour the sand back on the dog and the dog would turn back to normal. That was a joke because he had never seen rain before. Imagine how something would act if he had never seen rain before. We have pets in here. I think most of us, or a lot of us, are pet owners. What do your pets do the first time they see snow? Anybody remember that? They try to jump up and catch it? All right. I have one of those little dogs, half Dachshund, half Yorkie. He's a dorky. Really hurts his feelings when you call him that. But he's a weenie dog with hair, really, is what he turns out to be. And I remember the first time he saw snow, it was about 2 years ago here. He got outside and started running in circles in the snow. He just thought it was so cool. Then he got slower and slower and slower. And finally, he just stopped and started whimpering. But what happened was his legs froze together. And so he was going with like 2 pegs trying to move along, and finally all of it froze. And it was so funny because we had to pick him up, stick him in a room, and wait for it to melt. I enjoyed that probably a lot more than I should have. But, you know, it was a lot of fun, you know. He gets a little squeaky toy and put a foot in front of him where he can't move, and you squeak it, and you're like, oh, I wish I had that, you know. I'm on the radio. I probably shouldn't be saying that. I'm sorry. I always treat my dogs in a very nice way. All right. Well, imagine no rain, what it would be like. And imagine, more importantly, pertinently to this lesson, the faith Noah had. Because think about 120 years. Think about the size of that boat. And think about what everybody else thought about him. Noah was by himself, he and his family, in this world. And yet he trusted God enough to act on what he knew and saved his household through obedience. When you get to Ezekiel 14:14 and Ezekiel begins listing out the only people or the most faithful people have ever existed, Noah and Job are on that list. Okay? Now, how does that apply to today? You ever feel like you're alone in the world? Hopefully not, because you have the church. But I hope you feel outnumbered because your morality is high enough. Your propensity to work for God is strong enough. You've got to recognize you're outnumbered. And we have to recognize that Christianity, from the world's perspective, will not make sense. People looked at Noah and they thought to themselves, why in the world is the guy building a boat and it's not in the water? It's never rained. Why is he building a boat on dry land? How dumb can you be? And yet Noah listened to God and he obeyed. People today look at us and they think, well, why is that person faithful in their marriage? Nobody is faithful in their marriage. Or a person looks at us and they say, why do they give so much to the church? Why do they get up every Sunday? Why do they take care of the poor? Why do they sacrifice themselves? And to the world's perspective, it doesn't make sense. Because Christianity is about faith, about power, and about trust towards God. It's about putting Him first in everything that we do. And that's why it's interesting when you go back to 2 Peter 3, once again, Peter uses the example of Noah. He says, listen, these people are telling you there's not going to be a second coming. There's not going to be a resurrection. Every day comes as it always has. Every season comes as it always has. Don't worry about it. Don't make your life all about Christianity because it doesn't make sense. And Peter says, never rained. It's never happened this way before. And he said, and in an instant, the judgment of God came, and all those people were swept away, except those who are faithful. That's why we see the importance of faithfulness towards God. 2 Peter chapter 3, that's 1 Peter. Is that 1 Peter 3? I'm thinking about 1 Peter 3, the example of Noah, and I'm also thinking about 2 Peter chapter 2. That's right, he's mentioned in both places. All right, that was last week. Now this week, let's look at verse 8. Abraham. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. He went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky, a multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. Okay, Abraham was called. He was called 2 different times. Sometimes we don't mention that very much. You look in Acts 7, we see where he is called from Ur of the Chaldean area, which is called Haran. Okay? On my little blackboard here that I have, just imagine it's there. You're going to have Israel here, right? Egypt's down here, Israel's here. And then you have this ring right here. And that is what's called, anybody remember? The Fertile Crescent, okay? And then over here you have modern day Iran, Iraq, Persia, all this stuff through here, okay? People never went straight across, did they? How come? Desert, absolutely. It was desert. Nobody lived there until the Saud family realized we've got oil here. And then finally that desert area turned into a country which relies absolutely on oil and nothing else because there's nothing else there except sand. But before then, especially back in these days, you had to go through here. Abraham was here. He was called. He came up to Ur of the Chaldees, was called again, and he came down and he lived life in what we know today as the Promised Land as we study Scripture and such. Now, he went not knowing where he was going. Can you imagine the faith required in that? How many people here grew up in Marshall County? Okay, most of us. Imagine going to a place where you don't know anyone. Imagine if you got up today and you went to, say, Slobodskoy, Russia, which is just south of the Arctic Circle. Okay? Now, what would be weird about that? Would they speak your language? No, they speak Russian. Would they have your faith? No, they're all Orthodox. There is a church there, but it's not very established. Okay? Do they eat what you eat? Do they have 4 pigs? No. Their favorite meal is borscht and radishes. That's what they really, really like to eat. Okay? Now, how long, and is it colder there than here? Absolutely. They're far enough up to the Arctic Circle where there's still daylight every day, but they go for 3 months where they only have daylight for 4 hours a day. Then you have 4 months where you have daylight for 18 hours a day. Okay? Now, would you feel very comfortable there if you just plopped up and landed right there? Not very long. It might be cool for a day because it's different. But imagine if you just plopped up and left your family, never to see your father and mother and brothers again, and just went there. Can you imagine the faith it would take to do that? And a lot of times we minimize what our missionaries go through. Changing cultures, changing lands, languages, habits, leaving behind family. Now that we have internet, it's a little bit better because you can, go back and forth to be able to see each other. Abraham gave all that up. He went to a place where they spoke different than he did. He went to a place where he could never build a house. Went to a place where everybody always thought, you don't belong here. You're a stranger. You're a foreigner. This is none of your business. Get out of here. He left and went to there to be that, to endure that. He went and lived in a land that was not his own because he considered his citizenship in heaven. Okay?
Before that, they were nomads. They circled for the agriculture.
Right. That's what they did through the Promised Land area. Now, Abraham came from Ur, so he was a city dweller, or at least his family was. And then he came down as far as on the nomadic side. And, he was wealthy. He brought a lot of people and and he accumulated a lot of flocks and herds and that sort of thing. God did bless him monetarily, but the point we're reading here in Hebrews is he left. Now, here are these Christians to whom the book of Hebrews is written, all right? They had begun in Judaism. Judaism was very family-oriented. You belonged to this tribe. You did what your father did. You had all these habits. You ate the same. Everybody was circumcised. Everybody had the same thing. Now, when you convert to Christ, instead of going to the synagogue on Saturday, you meet at somebody's house for church on Sunday, and there's Gentiles there. And you are among people who don't eat the way you eat. You're among people who don't circumcise their children. You're among people who work Saturday and see it to be no big deal. And you're among these people who are totally different in background than you are. And your family is over across the street at the synagogue saying, You're sinning by doing this. This is goofy for you, and you're turning your back on everything that you've ever believed and everything that you ever were. And on top of that, even a lot of the people in the Gentile world are picking on them and saying, you don't belong here, you're a vagabond, you're a foreigner. We don't like Christians, we don't like what Christians stand for, and we wish you'd get out of the way. Wish you would just go away. And so, if you're a Jewish Christian, especially here in this Gentile church, and Gentiles are picking on you, and Jews are picking on you, and all these things are happening, what's going to be the natural movement? To go back to where everybody is happy again, where your mama's happy again, and everything's the way it was. That's what those Hebrew people, the book to whom Hebrews is written, is going through. And so what the writer of Hebrews says is, listen, you're following Abraham, who left his family behind and followed after God. Now, how does that apply to us today? You got to come out of the world, right? Every single one of us. You've got the kid on the football team in the high school class, in the high school grade, right? And he's over somebody's house Friday night. All the guys are playing football. They're all cool. You know how football players are or basketball players are. Suddenly they pull out beer. They pull out liquor and start passing it around. As a Christian, what do you have to do? Not take it. Not take it. And get yourself out of that situation. What's everybody else going to think about you? They're weak. You're a mama's boy. You're scared of everybody else. You're not man enough to drink, right? There's a temptation to fit in. And when that person finds themselves in that situation, remember Abraham. Okay? You have got the kid who's gone off to college. And you stay out too late Friday night. You're in a big city, a different city at least. Sunday morning comes. You did not get in bed the night before until like 4 in the morning. You roll over and know it's time to get ready and go to church. But no one knows if you'll go or not. No one at that church, because you're in a new city, would recognize whether you're there or not. Nobody back home will know whether you're there or not. It's a lot easier to fit in with the world and just relax on Sunday. What's a Christian supposed to do? Get yourself up and you go. Whether anybody knows that you do it or not, because you're not a Christian to please anybody else. You're a Christian to please God. Okay? You're married now, you have kids and all that business. All right? More money than what otherwise would happen, but it's dishonest. But everybody else at work does it, or everybody else at work will never notice. You're struggling with your bills. Those kids cost a lot of money. Have you bought formula or diapers ever? Oof. I remember Matthew being potty trained, my first one being potty trained, and just feeling like I was a millionaire. You know, it was funny. Kyla was like, let's potty train him so he can grow up and be good in life. And I was like, let's potty train him so I can have some money again. But anyway, you know, kids cost a lot of money. And so if you're at work and there's a way you can maybe sponge off a little bit of money and nobody will notice, it sure would help at home. But as a Christian, what do? You got to be honest. In everything you do, you've got to be honest. It would make you different than everybody else. But that's what that idea of leaving comfort, living as a stranger, but being faithful to God, knowing that He will bless you. In this world, it's not going to make sense. But in the afterlife, it will make perfect sense. But that's a struggle. Now, those are 3 stereotypical things brought up. But I bet every one of us, and we're not going to take the time personally, can talk about moments in our life where we have faced where everybody in the world is doing something, and we've got to make a decision. Am I willing to be a foreigner in this country? Am I willing to be different because of my faith? Am I going to please God or men? Am I going to please God or please myself? That's the story of Abraham. That's what we see going on with him right here. Yeah, absolutely. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel 2. Throw us in that furnace. Or Daniel 3. Throw us in that furnace. Because, if God saves us, good. If he doesn't, we still will not bow down. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what we're after right there. Now, verse 11, Sarah. I'm not always a big fan of Sarah when you run through Genesis. Sarah doesn't always seem to be the greatest person in the world. Of course, she gets handed off several times by her husband, probably not a very good thing. Abraham's around Philistines, and he's scared of them, and he says, hey, why don't you marry my wife? Or he's around Pharaoh, hey, why don't you marry my sister again? And Pharaoh actually receives a curse because he was thinking about marrying Sarah, and he throws Abraham and Sarah out of the country. Sarah had it rough sometimes, and she had to leave her family. And I think about Sarah, who was going to have a child, and yet she was older, okay? And what did she do? She laughed. So her name was changed from Sarai to Sarah. She laughed, okay? Now, how old was Sarah when she had a child? 90, okay? Now, I do this in the teenage, I like doing when I'm in a teenage class, is I like saying, okay, who in the church is closest to 90 years old? Okay? You see why I'm not going to do it in here. But, you think, okay, who in the church is 90 years old or close to it? Okay? Now, imagine if they came next Sunday and said, we need a baby shower because I'm pregnant now. What would you think about that person? Time to put them in the funny farm, right? And even if it's true, they're going to have to go to the funny farm if they're having a baby at 90, okay? That's just crazy. Who wants a baby at 90? Who wants a baby at 45 or 50 like some people are doing nowadays? That's a lot of work, and it's really, really hard to do. But God told Sarah, you're going to have a child. Now, what's interesting is even though she thought it was crazy, she carried through. She was with Abraham, and she became pregnant. She went through it even though she thought it was the craziest thing she had ever heard. All right? We come to Christianity today. All right? Here we are today. And some people think, man, a cappella music without instruments. But I think it's a dumb rule. Okay? Even if you don't understand it, do you need to follow it? Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16 says we sing one to another. So in the church and worship, what should we do? Sing to one another, whether it makes sense or not. A lot of people have told me before, there's nothing special in that water. There's nothing sprinkled in it or prayed over it or whatever else. I just don't see the purpose in baptism. I don't see why I have to get wet. If I trust in God, if I accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, I don't see what getting wet does. It makes no sense for me at all. Whether it makes sense for you at all, what should you do? Be obedient to God. You see, God is God. Jesus is Lord. In Romans 1, we're warned that as people turn away from God, they will worship the creature rather than the Creator. And a lot of people put their own ideas first instead of God. Sarah thought this is the craziest thing ever, but she obeyed. She went through it, and she conceived and brought forth a child. And so it's really interesting seeing how that works with Sarah and how she is able to produce. Now verse 13, okay? These all died, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims of the earth, on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Okay? All right, they had not received the promises. Now, we expect things pretty quick, right? Right? Social Security check comes on what, the 30th? Is that right? Is that right? What day does it come on? The 3rd? Okay. Walmart's really crowded with all the people in the buggy. Now, you going to be okay with that? Absolutely not, because you expect to receive something at the time at which it was promised to you. Maybe you're paid weekly, maybe you're paid bi-monthly, maybe you're paid monthly, whatever else it may be. You expect those wages when you have accomplished those hours, right? Abraham gave up all his life to walk in the land, okay? How long was it till he received the land? No. We're talking like 600 years later, aren't we? Okay? Abraham receives a promise, you're going to have a child, okay? How long did he wait for that promise to be fulfilled? Several decades. Can you imagine God giving you a promise but not giving it? Can you imagine God giving you a promise but not fulfilling it until your descendants about 500 years later? That takes faith, doesn't it? Absolutely, yeah. Right. And why does God do that? To help us grow in faith. Okay? To help us grow in faith. In the same way, you and I, we're Christians. Okay? And as Christians, we recognize this world, these things that we can knock on, they're not what it's all about. The house you live in is not a big deal. The car you drive, not a big deal. What other people think about you, not a big deal. The possessions you own, not a big deal. As a Christian, what matters? Relationship with God, heaven. We are citizens of heaven, and we're foreigners. We're on our way to our home. Okay? We are on our way to our home. And so because of that, we recognize these things don't matter. Now, do we want them to be nicer rather than poor? Sure we do. Right? Say you're taking a journey. Here in a few weeks, I'm going to go to the Freed Hardeman Lectureship. I'm going to go down there for a week, okay? I'm going to stay in a hotel, I think, for 3 days or 4 days, something like that. My wife tells me to leave and where to go. I'm going to be in there for like 3 or 4 days. What do I take to the hotel with me? Clothes to wear, maybe some computer or whatever to do some work, those sort of things. Now, do I take everything that I own with me? Doesn't make sense to, does it? Because I'm not going to be there very long. And it's just a whole lot to deal with. Okay? Parents, or you go see your kids. You take what you need for the journey, but you don't pack a lot of extra stuff because it's just a lot more to deal with. How does that apply? Pack more because then you have to deal with more. Recognize all these things, they're tools. Tools to help us get where we need to be. Tools to help us live the way we need to live and do the things that we need to do. Okay, the world is a bridge. The wise man will pass over it while the foolish man tries to build his house on it. That is a quote from Anselm. Anselm wrote in Latin, so he made that last about 6 words, and I can't make it go 6 words, and it doesn't sound as neat. All right, now notice, each one of these people had an opportunity to return. Man, I'm tired of this. I'm headed back home and gone back to comfort. Tired of this. I'm going to stop building a boat and look like everybody else. Sarah could have said, man, this is crazy. I'm not even going to try. All these people had opportunity, but their faith was not a one-time decision. It was a lifetime decision. In the same way, your faith's not a one-time thing, but it's a lifetime thing that you do. Okay? I love how he ends it there. God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Now, we only have a few minutes, but you'll notice Exodus 3:6, verse 15, and chapter 4, verse 5. There's something really interesting there. When God appears to Israel and God appears to Moses, You know what he says? He says, listen, I am the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. You see, for the rest of the Old Testament, God introduces himself by these men who are faithful. It's almost like God's bragging on them. Moses, you need to listen to me because look what happened to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You ever notice grandparents, the first time grandparents, when they get a grandkid, what are they showing off next Sunday at church? Pictures, right? Used to, they had the little pictures like Polaroids that they could pass down the aisle. Now, a lot of times, they'll have an iPad or a phone where they're scrolling through those pictures. And you look, and it's just this wrinkly little kid. But that grandparent is like, he is so cute, you know? That's the way God is. And I'm Abraham's God. I'm Isaac's God. I'm Jacob's God. And it's fascinating to me how God is proud to be their God. And God's not ashamed of them. How does God feel when he thinks about us and the faith that I've shown in life and the faith you've shown in life? When we live by faith, God is proud to be our God. He is proud to be able to work through us. So as we get ready to close this class, look at your life and live a life that God is proud of by showing your faith in everything that you do. Okay, I'm going to let you out a little bit early. No running in the halls. Be careful. That's why I think it's raining. All these doors are open, and everybody leaves the church building is running. So either something really bad happened in that classroom back there, something really stinks, or it's raining.